So this is a video on how to complete the inquiry lab for metric measurement. So previously you already completed an inquiry lab using metric measurement, using some basic tools that you had around your house hopefully, or maybe you had to purchase a few, but using temperature, finding out volume, finding out displacement of water and liquid measurements. So all of this was using a metric scale. So it's not the normal American measurements that we're used to, but using the actual metric scale. That lab was a guided lab where it gave you step by step pretty much what you were supposed to do, and only had a few places where you got to pick the things that you were going to measure. Well, in this lab, this is an inquiry lab, and in inquiry labs, you actually, as the scientific researcher, you decide what you are going to study and try to look at and figure out. So that is for this inquiry lab. So for some of you guys, that's incredibly overwhelming to think about. What am I going to study? I don't know, but it gets easier as you move along. So for this, I'm going to make you a video so that you can get started on this, hopefully with very little stress. So I asked my own kids to look around and what could they study using these types of tools. So they all started with an observation, and some of the observations that they made was that it takes a long time to preheat the oven. The directions for microwaving something sometimes tell you to peel the corner of the plastic lid. Then they said they noticed that donut holes are cheaper than bigger donuts. We run out of ice quickly, and the directions on the spaghetti tell you to add salt to the water. So these were all just some observations that they had made. So then, using whatever observations you make, think of a testable question that you can solve using the metric system. So here were some testable questions that you could solve. If I just put the food in the oven while it's preheating, will the overall cooking time decrease? So instead of waiting for the oven to preheat, can I just put the pizza or whatever in a cold oven, and does that make the overall cooking time, is it shorter than if I wait to preheat it and then put the pizza in? If I want to make ice quickly, how much water should I put in the ice tray? What temperature of water will freeze the fastest in the ice tray? Does cold water freeze faster than hot water or room temperature? Does adding salt to water make it boil faster? And the next one, does adding salt to the water make the spaghetti cook faster? I'm sorry, I think I said that wrong. So one was asking if the salt makes the water hotter, and the other one was asking, does adding salt make the spaghetti cook faster? Okay, so try to pick something that has a control and a single one variable. So the one that we got rid of right away, the choice that we got rid of was the donuts holes versus regular, because it didn't really have a control. At this point, it was just a comparison of two things. So it was like, if we weigh donut holes and we weigh the same cost, if we spent $5 on donut holes and $5 on regular donuts, which one weighed more? It didn't really have a control. So we just were not going to try to make this one work, and we decided to get rid of that idea. So then our hypothesis, make sure that you make your hypothesis an if-then statement. Making it an if-then statement will mean you get full points or not full points for the hypothesis. So please make sure you start with the word if, and about halfway down the sentence you have the word then. So examples of that: if I fill up an ice cube tray with cold water, then it will freeze fastest. If I add salt to water before heating, then the water will start to boil sooner. If I add salt to the water before heating, then the water will actually boil at a hotter temperature. So these are all hypotheses that you could test, and for your experiment, you're only going to pick one. And you should pick your own. You should not, don't copy any of these. Like find something on your own that you could test. But for this example, we decided to move forward and test if I add salt to water before heating, then the water will start to boil sooner. So that's what we're going to work with the rest of this PowerPoint. So then I'm sorry about that. So then make a prediction. So the prediction here is I believe that the temperature of the boiling water will be hotter with salt than without salt. Increasing the amount of salt will also increase the water temperature. The water without salt will not be as hot. So your prediction here is that by adding salt, you're going to get hotter water. Okay, this should be your best guess as to the outcome, what you think is going to happen. As I've said before, it's okay if your prediction's wrong. It's okay if your hypothesis is wrong. In scientists, you're never trying to prove anything, so please don't use the word this proved that blah, blah, blah. No, you didn't prove anything, okay? So in science, doing a little test like this doesn't prove anything. It just shows that there's some data there to support something. So please don't write proved on anything, but the data can kind of show one thing or another, and it's okay if it's wrong because you still showed that this method doesn't work, and so that's okay. So the next is build an experiment and write out the steps. So the first thing you're going to do is write out the supplies. The supplies here are water, salt, thermometer, measuring cup, pot, and stove. How I will keep measurements. I'll measure using a thermometer, and I'm going to take measurements every 2 minutes and record it in a data table. I'll stop when the water reaches a rolling boil, which I said was going to be large bubbles. And then you're going to want to write step-by-step instructions. So here were my step-by-step instructions, but I actually cut it off and didn't copy and paste this last one here just because I felt like you couldn't read it because it was going to get too small. But here's the start of mine. I measured out 500 milliliters. See how I did that in metric? 500 milliliters. I didn't say like 2 cups. I said 500 milliliters into a cold pot. I recorded the temperature in Celsius, again in metric, of the cold water. I put the pot on the stove at full heat. I take the temperature in Celsius every 2 minutes and record that on a data table until it's at a rolling boil. Then once it's at the rolling boil and I've taken the temperature and recorded it, I'm going to dump out all that water and allow the pot to cool. So then for my second part of my experiment, now I'm going to measure out 500 milliliters of water in a cold pot, but this time I'm going to put 15 milliliters of salt. And I wrote as my own note, that's approximately 1 tablespoon. You don't have to write the standard measurements here, you can just write the metric, that's fine. And then record the temperature in Celsius of the cold water, put it on full heat, take the temperature every 2 minutes until it's at a rolling boil. And then I'm going to do that at least one more time. This time, instead of like 15 milliliters, I would maybe put in 30 milliliters, like 2 tablespoons, okay? So then I have my 3 data sets, one with no salt, one with a little salt, and then one with a lot of salt. So I have 3 data sets. You should have at least 3 or more data sets. So make sure you write out in this area what your control, your independent variable, and your dependent variable are. This is one area that students have a lot of problems. Your control is just what you're going to be doing that's just regular, that you're going to compare everything to. So for me, the control is just the boiling water but without salt. Just regular water, no salt, that's my control. Then my independent variable is the one that I am like changing. So the independent variable is the thing that I'm changing. So for this is the amount of salt. So one time I had low salt, one I had high salt. So that is the amount of salt. The amount of salt is my independent variable. Then my dependent variable depends on how I made this change. So I remember that dependent variable, like that change depends on whatever I did. So here it's how long it took to boil depending on how much salt I put in. So for me, the amount of time it takes to boil is my dependent variable. Okay, so then I don't know why this turned itself red when I formatted the slideshow, so I'm sorry. But this shows a sample data table that I would use, and this is only one, but for this lab there should have been 3, but I just didn't want to bother to write up 3 for this. But my data table here would say like the amount of water, the amount of salt, the time, and the temperature. So I said like 500 milliliters of water. This will be the same all the way down. The amount of salt was 0 in my, and I wrote because it's the control, just to keep it clear in my own mind. The time is the time that I took the temperature. So I have the starting time was 0 minutes. This is before it started boiling. And I wrote that it was 25 degrees C on my thermometer. And then after 2 minutes, it was up to 37 degrees C. After 4 minutes, it was 50 degrees C. And after 6 minutes, it was 68 degrees C. Now this still wouldn't be boiling. 100 degrees is boiling. So your data table would be longer than this. Then you would want to make another data table with like the 15 milliliters of salt. So you would have 15 milliliters of salt, the times, and the temperature. Then you would have one more data table that would have the 30 milliliters of salt, the times that you took the temperature, and what the temperature was. And then you're going to include a graph of your data. So using this data table, you're going to make a graph. I put a graph here that you could see from another student, and I included this one because she frankly had all the correct things that would get her full credit on this. So she put all 3, well, for her, she had 6. She had 6 different data sets here, and I want you to put all data sets on one graph, so you're not making 3 separate graphs. So you have 3 data tables, but you have one graph that you're going to put all of this on. So the first thing is that she did a line graph. Bar graphs and pie graphs, those kind of things, you rarely use them at this age, and really they're kind of a little kiddish at this point for you guys. So you should always have a line graph at this point. So you should always have, you can hand draw this or you can draw it on the computer. I actually do have a separate video on how to just use like Google Docs to insert a graph that you build. So you can check that out if you're interested. But you should make sure that you have a descriptive title. Make sure that you have an x-axis, and that on the x-axis you have numbers and a description of what those numbers are. So for her, she had numbers and she said time in days. For most of you guys, the x-axis will be time. Time will be listed on the bottom. Sometimes not, but almost always time goes on the bottom. Then up here going on the y-axis, she has numbers, and then she has a description, number of fish that she caught. Okay. And then she has a legend describing what each line was. So you can see her lines here. For like pink, you could follow that all along. And I mean, that's kind of the making of a good graph. So I can read the lines and you could quickly compare that. Okay. So if you have 3 data sets, you'll have 3 lines on here. If you have four charts or 5 or 6 charts, then you're going to have, 4, 5, 6 lines, depending on what you have. Okay, then you're going to analyze the results. And from this experiment, we said the data from my lab seemed to show that the higher the salt was, the longer the water took to boil. So the more salt we added in, it actually took longer to boil. However, the ending temperature of the water was higher in the salt water. The water without salt came to boil faster, but boiled at a lower temperature. So the water just got hotter when it had salt in it. So conclusion, this is where you write up your end thoughts and findings, you also accept or reject your hypothesis. So here we said, my original hypothesis was that when salt was added, the water would boil faster. However, the water took longer to boil when salt was added. I reject my original hypothesis. Or if you were right, you can say, I accept my original hypothesis. But here we reject. And then you say something like, though my hypothesis was wrong, I learned blah, blah, blah. And then you would also say, in the future, I could test this or that. And give a little summary of what you learned, what the outcome was, what you're going to try differently if you were ever to try this again. So that's how you complete this inquiry lab on metric measurement. Please think of some unique thing that you could test using these types of tools at home. And I hope that you come up with some really interesting things. If you have questions or want some feedback, we actually have a discussion board on how, to sound off and where you can get help from each other on this.